Okay, it's 12:02, so I'm going to begin. Hello, my name is Craig Lean. I'm a partner at K&L Gates in the Labor, Employment, and Workplace Safety Practice Group in our DC office. I'm here today to do part 3 of the Affirmative Action Verification webinar series. And really, the third time is the charm. It is the big announcement. Today, we'll be talking about the contractor portal itself, which was recently released by OFCCP. And I think that the best way to do it, I want to be very efficient with the use of everyone's time today. And we do have a number of attendees that are signing up, and I see the number still increasing. So this is recorded. So if someone's not able to attend today and you know that, please send them a link. But I'm hoping to make this as pragmatic and helpful as possible to each of you. So before I begin, just so you know a little bit about my background, I was the former OFCCP director. I am the former OFCCP director. I was the director for several years. I was at the Department of Labor from November 2017 to early 2021. And for a couple of those years, I was the director. And as part of that, I got a lot of insights into the OFCCP affirmative action verification process. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of the contractor portal and where I think it's going to be going over the course of the next 2, 3, 4 years, along with some very practical advice that I hope I can impart to you based on some of the insights I would have as the former OFCCP director and also as a practitioner in the field. This is an area where I practice at K&L Gates. I advise a lot of federal contractors and subcontractors on affirmative action requirements. And actually, I will tell you, seeing some of these requirements from the perspective of the contractor community has been very helpful and enlightening to me, having been a former federal agency head. So, I really think everyone should have the experience of being at the agency and also working for contractors. I think that gives you a very valuable perspective. So hopefully this will be very valuable today. Let's begin. First, I'm going to be sharing, as I mentioned, my screen for most of this with different web pages. So hopefully that will work. We're going to start now. Oh, that didn't work. Let me try it again. One more time. Share web browser. Well, it's not doing it exactly how I was hopeful. So I'm going to have to type them in. Forgive me. So the first place we're going to go, actually, this is good because it will allow you to see how we look these up. You go to the OFCCP contractor portal. It's right here. So this is the portal. For a long time, this page had said Affirmative Action Verification Initiative coming soon. Now we have the actual portal itself. It's a similar looking page, but it has a lot more information. Highly recommend that everyone go to this page. Here's a few things that you should know first of all. Let's look right at the OFCCP contractor portal rollout timeline. February 1st, 2022, registration opens. So you're going to be able to visit this as a federal contractor or subcontractor, visit this webpage, and you can see the web address at the top. And starting February 1st, you will be able to actually register your company. We're going to talk about in a little bit how you do that. And I highly recommend that you do it on February 1st or February 2nd. One thing that I have seen in my experience as a government official is that a lot of times these web pages don't work as well as is anticipated. Now, a lot of time has been put into this portal, so hopefully it will, but it's better to do things early. Often the government has to end up extending the time to comply. We don't know if the OFCCP will do that here. So I would recommend getting on right February 1st. Now, that gives you then about 2 months to prepare to do your certification after you've registered, because certification period begins March 31st, 2022. Now, for those companies that have a compliance program in place and you have been updating your AAPs yearly and you comply with the OFCCP regulations, you may be able to go right in on March 31st and certify. For companies that are already in compliance, the certification requirement is not much, as you will see. It's simply basically checking boxes. And then lastly, June 30th, 2022, and this is the big date that I would circle, and make sure that if you take one thing from today's presentation, you're taking that June 30th, 2022, the certification period ends. And it's extraordinarily important that you have certified by that date. And we'll talk about why in a second. So you may ask, well, you tell me more about these guidelines. And what I thought would be the most efficient and effective way to do that would be to go through the OFCCP Contractor Portal FAQs one by one, and I can give you some insights into each of them. Now, one thing you should know about OFCCP FAQs is that these constitute something that's called sub-regulatory guidance. Typically, the agency will follow the FAQs that it issues, and a lot of thought is put into them. For an FAQ to be posted, typically it has to go through the OFCCP director and the Solicitor of Labor's office. And sometimes, for something of this significance, it may even have to go to the Secretary of Labor. So my view is that you can rely on FAQs. Now, the one thing that you need to think about with FAQs, though, is that they can be easily updated or changed. So it's often, if you're going to rely on a particular FAQ, it's probably a good idea to take a picture of it, a screenshot, or just take a photo with your iPhone. But that may be useful down the line if the FAQs change and you've relied on an FAQ, potentially to your detriment. You may want to show the agency, look, I relied on this FAQ, now you're holding this against me. This is why I did it. That could be very helpful. So FAQs are really useful, but it comes with the caution that they can easily be updated or changed. So let's start with the first FAQ. What is the contractor portal? There's some really important information in this FAQ question and answer. It says the contractor portal is a new OFCCP platform where covered federal contractors and subcontractors must certify whether they are meeting their requirement to develop and maintain annual AAPs. Scheduled contractors will also be able to use the portal to upload their AAPs during a compliance evaluation. For a 3-line FAQ, there is so much information in there. And by the way, I'm not just going to read every FAQ. I wanted to read this one, though, in full, because there's a lot of information in there that you should think about. First of all, this talks about covered federal contractors and subcontractors and defines them both as contractors. So first, covered. What does that mean? Typically, a covered federal contractor and subcontractor is one that meets the jurisdictional requirements. Now here, as you'll see later, the jurisdictional requirement will be the requirement to do an AAP, an affirmative action program. And typically that requirement starts at $50,000 and 50 or more employees, although the jurisdictional requirement is different for veteran. But to have that basic requirement to sign up and register with the portal, to be a covered federal contractor and subcontractor, you're going to be looking at the $50,000 and 50 employee thresholds. Second, it says contractors and subcontractors. This is very interesting. For many, many years, OFCCP has focused almost the entirety of its supply and service compliance program and auditing program on contractors, not on subcontractors. Even though subcontractors had the duty and the obligation to comply to the same extent as contractors did, based on all the same jurisdictional thresholds, typically because of OFCCP's scheduling methodology, the agency did not focus on subcontractors because they didn't know who all the subcontractors were. Now, a caveat here real fast. If you look at OFCCP's fall 2021 regulatory agenda, there is a proposed rule that OFCCP has raised where they would require contractors to notify the agency every time they bring on a new subcontractor. Now, that's a potentially huge obligation for contractors. When I was director, one thing we had looked at when we did the scheduling letter review was whether, when we were updating our scheduling letter, whether we would require contractors to notify about their 3 largest subcontractors. And after notice and comment, the agency ended up not going forward with that. Well, this is a much larger obligation by several orders of magnitude. This obligation, as I read it, and remember, there's not a lot of information there in the fall regulatory agenda, but basically similar to what construction contractors do in notifying the agency about construction subcontractors, contractors will have to notify the agency about their subcontractors. Well, one, that's going to be a significant burden. You're going to have to be updating OFCCP all the time, presumably through the contractor portal, I would think. But second, that will allow the agency to check whether those subcontractors are certifying or not. So the point, and the reason I mentioned this, if you're a subcontractor and you do not have a compliance program in place, or if you advise subcontractors, tell them to take a close look at this FAQ and also at the fall regulatory agenda for DOL, because it looks like the agency is coming for subcontract. And so it would be incumbent and probably the best practice, certainly, and required by law, frankly, for subcontractors to go ahead and prepare to certify as well. I say that again, if you're a subcontractor and you don't have a compliance program in place, talk to counsel, talk to consultants, get a program in place so that you can certify, because you're going to be required to certify to the same extent as contractors, most likely. One other thing just to note, I'm not going to talk about it a lot today, but scheduled contractors will also be able to use the portal to upload their affirmative action programs during a compliance evaluation. It's an important point to know. The days of just emailing your affirmative action program to OFCCP and all the security concerns that might cause for that information are done. You'll essentially be using the portal now to be updating or to be providing your affirmative action programs to OFCCP, to be updating them with information. This portal is quite versatile, and my guess will be ultimately OFCCP will do much of its interaction with federal contractors and subcontractors through the portal itself. So that leads to the question, why is OFCCP requiring contractors to use the contractor portal? I'm not going to read this whole one. What I will tell you is that it basically says that there was a Government Accountability Office report in 2016 during the Obama administration. So this whole program goes through 3 administrations: the Obama administration, Trump administration, now the Biden administration. And that report basically said that OFCCP has no process for ensuring that the tens of thousands of establishments that have signed a qualifying federal contract have developed an AAP within 120 days of the commencement of the contract or updated it annually. In fact, you might want to take a look at the Government Accountability Office report, because there is a link right here, report 16-750. Let's click on it. I highly recommend you take a look at this report. I'm not going to go through it all right now, but what Government Accountability, GAO basically said was that up to 85% of contractors are not in full compliance with their AAP obligations so that they can respond to a scheduling letter within 30 days. That was really the impetus for the entire affirmative action verification initiative. Next, who is required to use the contractor portal? This is another important FAQ that you should take a close look at. Supply and service contractors and subcontractors, again, who meet certain jurisdictional thresholds are required to use the portal to register and certify their AAP compliance. And then they have the jurisdictional requirements, so make sure to check this. If you hold a contract of 50,000 or more and employ 50 or more employees, you must develop and maintain, and the contract obviously has to be with the federal government. You must develop and maintain AAPs pursuant to EO 11246, Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act. If a contractor has at least 50 employees and a contract of 150,000 or more, again with the federal government, then it must develop an AAP pursuant to VEVRA. Another point, you need to, if you qualify for all 3 of those, if you meet the thresholds, just remember, practice point, you need to have an affirmative action program in place for all 3 of those authorities for every establishment that you have. There may be some exceptions to that related to single entities or separate entities, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But that's the general rule. It's important to remember that, because a lot of companies will only have an affirmative action program at the establishment that has the contract with the federal agency. And at all the other establishments in the company, there will not be affirmative action programs in place. In addition to that, a lot of companies will only have one affirmative action program for the Executive Order 11246 and may not have affirmative action programs for Section 503 and VEVRA. So please take a close look at that, because this contractor portal, as you'll see, is going to hold you to account in the sense that you're going to have to verify, check a box for every establishment that a company has for these 3 AAPs. So please keep that in mind. There's a very helpful OFCCP jurisdictional threshold infographic if you have a question about whether the executive order, Section 503, or VEVRA apply to you. Next, are construction contractors required to use the contractor portal? The short answer is no. Although stay tuned, that might change one day. But the short answer is no. Currently, no. Next, Where can contractors get resources and guidance on how to develop AAPs? OFCCP has some helpful resources here. They have a sample affirmative action program landing page. I'm not going to go to it right now, but there's a number of FAQs as well related to affirmative action programs. And you can also contact the nearest OFCCP area or district office for compliance assistance. One tip here, OFCCP has a very useful help desk, and you can even make online requests to OFCCP's help desk. One thing that's important to remember about the Affirmative Action Verification Initiative is when this went to the Office of Management and Budget, the White House, OMB, when it went there for approval through the whole information collection process, one of the reasons why the agency provided a 90-day period for companies to come into compliance before they have to certify, one of the reasons was so that companies could seek compliance assistance. You can seek compliance assistance from the agency, or you can contact a consultant or a law firm to talk about these things. One thing that I highly recommend is to bring in counsel. If you're not in compliance, bring in counsel, establish an attorney-client privilege relationship, and work with that counsel to determine what you need to do to come into compliance. A lot of times we talk about the importance of the attorney-client privilege in relation to pay equity, but it also is in relation to general compliance obligation, because you really want a counsel to come in and take a look at your entire program and tell you what you would need to do under privilege. And then also, what are the risks of non-compliance? A lot of times the agency will tell you, well, look, if you want to do maximum compliance in the sense that we can give you a guarantee that you're fully in compliance, you would need to do this. If you want to be in compliance generally, but there may be some risk because there's different ways to interpret certain provisions, this is what you would need to do. If you're not in compliance, here are the consequences. It's very helpful to have an attorney go through that all with you under privilege so that that's kept confidential. But, if it's more a question about what do I include in an AAP program, or do you have some example affirmative action programs, it's also helpful to go to the agency itself and to get that information. One thing, though, that, if you're not in compliance, instead of going to the agency and talking about your non-compliance, it may be better, and I would recommend it as an attorney, to come to counsel first under privilege to assess your situation and then determine how you should interact with the agency. A lot of times when I was OFCCP director, it would actually be the attorney who would reach out to the policy division, and the current policy director, who I appointed when I was director, is Tina Williams. And you may want to contact Tina and her team to reach out to her and get this information. But a lot of times it would be the attorney reaching out for a company, and they may not even disclose the name of the company, just with a question, a general compliance question. And OFCCP would typically provide a response. So that's another reason why you may want to talk to counsel or to a consultant. Will? One second, I just want to make sure I didn't skip it. Yes. Will certifying compliance in the contractor portal exempt a contractor from compliance evaluations? Well, that's a pretty succinct answer. No. Certification that a contractor has developed and annually updated their AAPs will not exempt them from compliance evaluations. Now, this is a point where I wanted to go to the original directive that started the Affirmative Action Verification Program. So bear with me. I'm going to try to do that right now. By the way, this will give you a good, again, it'll show you how you can access the OFCCP's website and get certain helpful directives and other compliance guidance. So what you do is you go OFCCP directives. Right here, directives, U.S. Department of Labor. You scroll down to Affirmative Action Verification Program Verification, Affirmative Action Program Verification Initiative. So take a look. This is when it all began. August 24th, 2018. This was the directive that initiated the Affirmative Action Verification Program. Take a look at what the policy of the program is. OFCCP will develop a comprehensive program to verify that federal contractors are complying with AAP obligations on a yearly basis. The program includes, and there's 5 parts. 1, development of a process whereby contractors would certify on a yearly basis compliance with AAP requirements. Well, that's the contractor portal. 2, this is the key point. Inclusion of a criterion in the neutral scheduling methodology, increasing the likelihood of compliance reviews for contractors that have not certified compliance with the AAP requirements. So what that's telling me is that for companies that are supposed to register according to OFCCP's records and either don't register, or when they register certify non-compliance, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that the agency will be including a criterion in their future neutral scheduling methodology, making it more likely that companies that are not in compliance will be chosen for audit. So that's one of the key reasons why it's so important to certify compliance if you can do so. Because otherwise, there's a much higher likelihood, and this directive is still on OFCCP's website, it's still the policy of the agency, and it's also common sense that the agency will be focusing its audits on companies that do not certify. And there it is in black and white. That's what it says. Now, does that mean that if you do certify that you're not going to be reviewed? No. And that's why the agency included that FAQ. They're still going to audit companies that certify compliance. But will your chances of being audited likely decrease if you certify compliance? I would say yes. And that's based on this criteria. A couple other quick things to look at before we go away from the directive is that the program includes compliance checks to verify contractor compliance with AAP requirements, requesting proffer of the AAP by contractors when requesting extensions of time to provide support data in response to a scheduling letter, and development of information technology to collect and facilitate review of AAPs provided by federal contractors. Let me tell you, all 5 of these things have now been done by the agency in one way or another. So as you can see, it's very likely that criterion number 2, inclusion of the criteria in the neutral scheduling methodology, will be done by the agency. Let's go back to the FAQs. So simply certifying will not exempt you from being reviewed, but it's likely, in my opinion, to reduce the chances you'll be reviewed. What measures has OFCCP taken to ensure contractor data is secure? I'm not going to go through all this, but I like that OFCCP was very specific here about how it's protecting data from different types of cyber attacks. I think it's very useful information. This portal is going to be used by the agency probably for any sort of information collection from contractors going forward. So now let's go to the registration FAQ. How can a contractor register for the contractor portal? So now there's some very important information in this FAQ response. It says that in logging in and registering in the login.gov sort of web page, that you will be required to enter your employer identification number. Here's the key: EEO1 headquarter, company number, and establishment unit number. What this will essentially do, and OFCCP right now doesn't have a user guide for this. It did when it went through the Office of Management and Budget. There was an admin guide and a user guide attached, but they haven't attached them here to the contractor portal web page. There's speculation that OFCCP is likely to update it. But one thing that was in the older manual and is sort of repeated here, or at least implied here, is that the agency is going to be looking at your entire corporate structure, including your parents, affiliates, and all establishments, because they're going to be using your EO1 headquarter company number and establishment unit number. Now, if a contractor does not know its EO1 identifiers, you're required to enter the EIN, your legal business name, your DUNS number, and your NICS code. When should a contractor register for the contractor portal? Existing contractors may register starting February 1st, 2022. OFCCP strongly recommends that contractors start registering as soon as possible. I think that's very notable that they're doing that, because I think they're anticipating, that a lot of companies will be registering, and it could cause issues with the interface. And so that's why I think they're giving a lot of time. They're giving more time than they needed to. They only really needed to give 90 days. They're giving a lot more time than that from when OMB approved this. So I think in part they're doing that, and they're giving February, March, April, May, and June. So basically, 5 months full, 150 days or so, to register and verify, in addition to all the time that's already been provided. So I think they recognize that there could be issues with 25,000 federal contractors and many subcontractors logging in to verify and to register and verify compliance. So again, I would recommend that you do this early, February 1st or soon after. And again, I would recommend you talk to counsel before then, so that once you register, you're also prepared to figure out how to interact with the portal, what establishments to list, et cetera. And we'll talk about that in a second. When can contractors, one other point, new contractors have 120 days to develop their APs and must register and certify compliance in the contractor portal within 90 days of developing their APs. It's a very important point, because the intent of this portal is to be used annually. There'll be an annual certification requirement, and it's anticipated, obviously, that there will be contractors that come into federal contracting that aren't presently a federal contractor, but after the contractor portal is established. Well, those companies have 120 days, according to regulation, once they have that federal contract that becomes effective, to develop their APs, basically 4 months, 120 days, and then they must register and certify compliance within 90 days of developing their APs. So what does that mean? That basically you have a maximum of 210 days, 120 plus 90, from when you get your federal contract and it becomes effective to when you need to certify compliance with OFCCP. So if you're a company that has 50 establishments and you take on a federal contract, you're going to have 120 days to then put AAPs in place for all of those establishments. And then you're going to have 90 days to verify compliance. So really you're supposed to comply within the 120 days, of course. But in terms of when the OFCCP is really going to begin looking at that, you have 210 days to be able to verify compliance. So that's going to be something that's important for contractors. One other thing to think about, and I've seen some speculation about this, is this contractor portal will be able to be used by OFCCP probably as part of their pre-review process. So if you're a new contractor coming into a new federal contract, under the regulations, there's a pre-review period where the agency gets not that very long a time, but a fairly short time to check whether you're in compliance or not. And typically, it's a very routine sort of ministerial act where the agency will just notify companies, look, you're a new contractor, you have an AAP requirement. But now for existing contractors who want to bid on a new contract, and there's a pre-review component to that, the agency will be able to look at the contractor portal to see if that particular existing contractor is in compliance or not. And if you're not, the agency could conceivably send you a show cause notice or not clear your pre-review because you're not in compliance with the certification portal program. So that's something that you should keep in mind as well. Anyway, the point here is that new contractors, you're going to have to certify as well, and it won't necessarily be by June 30th, 2022. If you get a new contract in August, you're going to have your 120 days to put it into place, your AAPs, so till December, and then you're going to have until basically March to certify. But every contractor, even future ones that meet the thresholds, are going to have to certify. And for contractors bringing in new subcontractors, you need to make sure to let your subcontractors know that. In addition to including the Equal Opportunity Clause, I think it would be a courtesy to let them know that, hey, you have this obligation now, and OFCCP may come calling in the future. You may want to get everything in place. You have a legal obligation to do so. When can contractors begin to certify their compliance? March 31st, 2022. That's an important point, a distinction. You can start registering by February 1st, but you really can't certify compliance until March 31st. And so that's when the window, March 31st to June 30th, will open, and that's when the agency will be accepting certification. Similar to EO1 reporting, where the EOC has a portal window where you can go in there and you can submit your EO1 reports. OFCCP will have the same thing. Now EOC recently extended its portal. It's now closed, but it extended its portal a couple times. Will OFCCP extend their portal? I wouldn't count on it. There's technical problems, maybe, but my thinking is because OFCCP is going to be using this as part of their scheduling criteria, and they want to issue another scheduling list typically in the fall, they're going to want to get this information as soon as possible so they can start composing the scheduling list. Scheduling lists typically take about 2 months to put together. I'll show you the methodology in a little bit. But they typically take a couple months to put together. If they're going to include a methodology about certification in there, companies that didn't certify, if they're going to focus their next scheduling list on that group, you want to make sure to have your certification in place by June 30th. Contractors that have functional affirmative action programs, are they required to use the contractor portal? Yes. So, just as a brief tutorial for those who don't know what a functional affirmative action program is, but, typically companies are organized for OFCCP purposes by establishment, geographical place where you have employees. And you have to have an affirmative action program in place for every establishment over 50 employees, 50 or more employees. You also, for those employees where it's smaller establishments, you may need to include them in other AAPs. Typically, the OF agency's position is that every employee needs to be in an AAP. So, for bigger companies in particular, I've seen some of them where they have thousands and thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of employees. They set up functional affirmative action programs where they don't set up their affirmative action by establishment geographically. They set it up by line of business that crosses across geography. So it could be for all technicians at a major airline manufacturer. It could be all your administrative personnel for a very large accounting firm. It could be all of your attorneys separated from all of your paralegals, separated from all of your other support personnel for a law firm that has offices all over the country. It's not based on geography, it's based on the line of business at issue. So the point, though, is that if you have a functional affirmative action program agreement, you have to verify for every line of business that you have your functional affirmative action program in place. Can a contractor have multiple users register for the contractor portal? Yes, thankfully. A contractor can have multiple users register for the contractor portal, so it's not going to all fall on one person. And during registration, can contractors update information about their company in the contractor portal? Yes, you'll be able to update information. So that's really everything that the agency has provided as of this moment on the contractor portal webpage. It has the calendar, it has the FAQs, and then there's a lot coming soon. There's going to be a how-to video about how to register with a known identifier. There's going to be a video about how to register when your identifier is unknown and how to update your establishment. Now, one thing I don't see, and I wanted to talk about briefly. Oh, also, there'll be a user guide and references, and it says it's coming soon. Okay, let me take a moment now. Now, one thing, there's a fundamental issue with the contractor portal that the agency is going to have to provide more guidance about, and that many people on this call are probably thinking about. Let me go to that right now. As you can see, I've gone to OFCCP's single entity test FAQs. Why am I coming here? Well, as I mentioned before, many companies out there may only have an AAP in place for the establishment that has an agreement with the federal government. And of course, one thing I wanted to make clear today to those on the call, those on this webinar, the agency expects you to have and the regulations require that you have an affirmative action program in place for every establishment or line of business at your company. So even if you only have one federal contract that meets the AAP requirement, in your Cleveland establishment, you have 30 other establishments across the country. Those other establishments, including your headquarters, have to comply with the AAP requirement. And one thing we saw from the user guide, not the current one, obviously, because it's coming soon, but the prior user guide that was approved by OMB, is that the agency is going to make you verify for every single establishment. This is a verification of the federal government, which should be subject to the False Claims Act, subject to the penalties for making false statements to the government. They're going to make you verify for every establishment that you have an AAP in place. Okay. I think that most companies understand that and are hopefully using this time to put their AAPs in place. Well, there's a bigger question as well. And this is where we need more guidance from the agency, I would recommend. This is the single entity test FAQs, because here's how OFCCP views its authority. Let's say you are a company that has 5 affiliated companies and a corporate parent, and that your company is the only one that has the federal contract. Okay? But let's assume, for purposes of the EEOC and your EO1 reporting, that your corporate parent is the one that submits the EO1 report, and it lists you and all of your affiliates in its EO1 report. Okay? Maybe your subsidiaries as well, if you haven't. So it lists the whole corporate family. It includes that in the EO1 report. So now, as you saw earlier in the FAQs, OFCCP has said that you're going to have to basically notify the agency when you register about your EO1 corporate parent. And the thinking is, and this was based on the OMB information when this went through the regulatory approval, is that OFCCP is going to populate the data. Populate the data. When you sign up, you're going to see your corporate parent, presumably your affiliates, and all of the establishments for all of them, conceivably. Now, you may take the position, well, wait, we're a separate entity for purposes of our OFCCP obligations from our affiliates and our parent. But the point, and many companies take that view, and in fact, as an attorney, I have advised companies on that very issue. And here's where I would go. You go to the regulations, of course, but an easier thing to do in terms of being able to access it easily for non-lawyers, for example, or for lawyers as well, because these are very useful, and these show the agency's position, you go to the single entity test FAQs. So, and it's the second FAQ in particular. And these FAQs were issued when I was director. I updated these. What factors does OFCCP apply when determining whether a separate business organization and a required company is so closely related to the acquiring federal contractor that it would constitute a single entity subject to OFCCP's jurisdiction? OFCCP applies 5 factors. Whether the entities have common ownership, whether the entities have common directors and their officers, whether one entity has de facto day-to-day control over the other through policies, management, or supervision of the entity's operations, whether the personnel policies of the entities emanate from a common or centralized source, and the operations of the entities are dependent on each other, e.g., services are provided principally for the benefit of one entity by another, and or both entities share management, offices, or other services. Now, that's a very complex test, in my opinion. There's a lot of language there. I want you to know I tried to simplify it when I was OFCCP director, but it's hard to simplify because it's based on case law. And a lot of this is taken from cases. There's a couple cases that are listed in the paragraph. So this is why it's so critical to interact with counsel on what happens to your affiliated companies and your corporate parent. And this is why it's also very important for OFCCP, say this again, it's very important for OFCCP to provide an option when you certify compliance. Just as a reminder, again, OFCCP hasn't put this on this webpage, but this comes from the OMB approval. There were 3 ways you could certify. You could certify yes, you have affirmative action programs in place as applicable. 2, no, you don't have them in place. Or 3, that you have a contract but are not subject to the requirement yet because the 120 days haven't passed. So basically, yes, no, and not applicable, but for a very specific reason. That you have a contract, the 120 days haven't passed. But presumably, after the 120 days have passed, you would be able to certify yes. Okay, what's missing? Certification number 4, which is we are part of the corporate family of a federal contractor, but we do not have AAP reporting obligations, AAP obligations, because we are not a single entity. We are a separate entity from the federal contract. So this is something which the agency is going to have to deal with because they are using EO1 reporting. Presumably, when you log in for the first time, they're going to have your whole corporate structure, but your position may be that many of those establishments, from affiliates, subsidiaries, and parents, are not subject to the AAP requirement because of this 5-factor test. And you're likely going to want to have counsel provide you an opinion on this point. And you're likely going to want to be ready to defend yourself to the agency. However, if the agency only provides 3 choices for your parents' establishments, you may be forced into the difficult decision of determining which of the 3 is most applicable to a situation where that particular establishment does not have an AAP obligation under your position. And one other thing, once you notify the agency that your position is that your parent and your affiliates are separate entities, you're not a single entity for purposes of OFCCP, it will give OFCCP the opportunity, conceivably, to contest that. Because now they'll know that you don't have an AAP in place at those establishments. This is something that the agency needs to address because it's causing a lot of anxiety, tension. And look, if affiliates and parents have an AAP obligation, well, fine, then enforce it. But they don't always have an AAP obligation. In fact, in many circumstances, they don't, because of the 5-factor test that the agency has published on their own website. So the agency should not penalize companies that want to avail themselves of this test. And that's why I'm speaking somewhat strongly on this point, but I think it's going to be the one issue that may thwart the contractor portal, at least to an extent, at least require it to be extended, because this issue needs to be dealt with, because there's 25,000 federal contractors, but conceivably, when you count affiliates, parents, and any related company, that could be in the even many more thousands of companies who may be taking the position they don't have an obligation to certify, and yet are being included in the OFCCP portal. So this is an issue that needs more guidance from the agency, hopefully soon. And hopefully the agency will be respectful of contractors who go through the test and determine that those affiliates and parents are not federal contractors for purposes of this review. Does that mean that they will roll over and not look at it at all? No. Maybe when they look at a particular company that they've scheduled for audit, maybe they'll take a look at this too in some way. But typically the history of the agency has been that it's been respectful of jurisdictional determinations like this. One other thing, if you end up on a scheduling list and you take the position that your parent or your affiliate is not a federal contractor for purposes of OFCCP obligations, but you're on the list anyway, the agency provides an email address that you can reach out to, or you can reach out to their operations division, which handles jurisdiction, and you can assert that point. And typically, again, I'm saying this as the former director, so I don't know the current policy, but typically, though, the agency has been respectful of that as long as you proffer that you satisfy the 5-factor test. I know I spent a lot of time on this point, but it's extremely important. One other thing to think about, because this is very helpful information too. When applying the single entity test, does OFCCP consider 1-factor determinant? The agency says no. So you should be looking at all 5 of the factors, but there's an important sentence right here. Though no single criterion is determinative under the single entity test, there is growing recognition that centralized control of employment decisions is the most important factor, citing to an ALJ order from 99, which is a while back, 22 years. But I can tell you that in terms of common sense as well, it makes sense because this is an employment. OFCCP is essentially applying employment law, civil rights employment law. And so the issue of whether your parent controls your employment decisions will likely be the major factor the agency looks at. And they've said that on their website. So you need to think about that. If you're very separate from your parent and your affiliates, if it's not all run through your corporate headquarters of your parent, and employment decisions are somewhat decentralized, it's more likely you're going to be able to argue that only the federal contractor company is the one subject to OFCCP regulation. This is actually a very useful FAQ too. It's not really in our subject. Take a look at it, but it talks about the issue of campus-like settings. Are separate buildings in a campus-like setting, do those require separate AAPs, or do you have to do one for your whole campus? It depends. But it also says here that the single entity test is not what you look to. That there's another set of FAQs that talk about campuses and buildings. So it's a good thing to know. Anyway, so that's what I wanted to talk about with the single entity FAQs. One last thing actually I wanted to show you all, because I've been asked about this in the past, is the OFCCP methodologies. You may ask, how does my company get selected for audit? Because I mentioned to you that the agency is likely to use this portal to include in its methodology a provision that says they're going to focus on companies that certify no, that they're not in compliance, or establishments that certify no, or also to companies that don't register at all. Well, here's what they do. Here's the one that was issued by this administration, the Biden administration, in March 2021. You can actually look at the methodology that's used to compose the scheduling list. You can check whether your company is more likely or less likely to have been included in this list. Typically, this is issued, though, when the actual corporate scheduling announcement list is published. So you'll know whether you're on the list or not. But often, OFCCP uses a similar methodology in every list. Why do I reference it? Because OFCCP is likely to include a sentence in this methodology in a future list that prioritizes companies that don't register or don't certify. Also, you can see if you look in the first paragraph that OFCCP composes its list extensively based on the FPDS, the Federal Procurement Data System. They also look at the DUNS number and the NICS code. They also look at the EO1 database if you go to the second paragraph. Why do I tell you this? Because if you were thinking that, well, if we don't register, OFCCP won't know that we're a contractor, that's unlikely to be a successful approach. Not only is it not compliant with applicable regulations, but the agency does have an ability to look at the FPDS and the EO1 database. So they'll be able to look at that and get a list of who is a federal contractor. They'll be able to compare that to the list of those who have registered. And those who don't register are very likely, in my opinion, to receive either a strongly worded email saying that you haven't registered, you need to do so by a certain date, or potentially a show cause notice or some sort of initiation of enforcement action, such as an audit, because of the failure to register. So that's why you have to be very careful. So let's go back to the contractor portal. We have about 10 minutes. I want to say one other point. You need to be very careful. This is the time. If you are not fully in compliance with the OFCCP regulations, this is the time to start putting that together. Get your general counsel involved. Get your get your EEO, civil rights, diversity and inclusion group working on this. Get your chief compliance officer working on this. Make sure that you're going to be able to certify that every establishment in your company has an AAP in place, and have ready an argument as to why you're, assuming you're not going to apply it to your partner, your parent and your affiliates, have an attorney, house or outside counsel, something I do, have counsel assess whether you're a single entity or not with these other affiliates and parents, and be prepared to defend why they don't have establishments in place. But make sure you don't fall into the fallacy or the mistake of having only going in on June 15th and recognizing, oh my goodness, we have 30 establishments. We only have an AAP in place for the establishment with the federal contract. Okay, we're going to certify yes for that one and no for the other 29. Don't make that mistake. You have 30 establishments. Start preparing the AAPs now, because you're going to truthfully certify. You have to. So when you get there in June 15th, you're going to be able to say, I have AAP programs in place for all 30. One other thing I'd raise with the agency that it needs to provide more clarification on, and I can tell you what the Trump administration position was on this, is that this is not intended as a gotcha. I want to be clear about that. This was not built as a gotcha. This was not intended as a gotcha. What do I mean by that? This is intended to ensure that every company has an affirmative action program in place at every establishment, that they're meeting the basic compliance obligations of being a federal contractor. It's not supposed to be, oh my gosh, you certified yes, and we found a technical violation in your AAP for that establishment when we did the audit. You shouldn't have certified yes because you weren't in full compliance. That is not the intent of this. We made that clear in the OMB when we submitted the information collection. Hopefully, it looks like from reviewing this that the agency will likely be taking a similar position. But that has to be the position of the agency, in my opinion. But it would be useful if the agency published some FAQs talking about, well, in order to be able to say that you have basic compliance, substantial basic compliance, so that you can certify yes, what are the basic things you need? Because there are a lot of AAP regulations, affirmative action regulations. Here's what I would suggest to companies. You should have an actual AAP plan, an affirmative action plan, a written plan in place for Section 503, VEVRA, and the executive order for every establishment where you have affirmative action obligation or your line of business. 2, I would highly suggest, based on the regulations, because this is a requirement, but I also think the agency is likely to look at this as something that's part of saying that you're in basic compliance. Make sure you're doing the annual review of your employment processes, promotions, your compensation, your hiring processes for all of your establishments. Make sure you're putting the notices up as well. Make sure you're doing all the things that would constitute basic compliance. But in addition to that, make sure you're doing that annual review. Because if you're not doing any of that, I think it's more likely the agency will say that you shouldn't have certified. For example, if you're not providing self-identification document for Section 503 for disability status, which is required, and there's a specific form you use. If you're not doing that at all, then I think there's a stronger argument the agency will have, hey, you're not in compliance. So why are you certifying that? It's these basic requirements. On the other hand, if the agency comes in and audits you and finds a disparity and engages in conciliation with you, but you have an AAP program in place and you've done the basic efforts you need to have that in place, I think that, of course, the agency is going to look at whether you're in violation and they're going to go through conciliation with you, but they shouldn't say, oh, you should never have certified. And so we're now going to make a False Claims Act claim. We're going to turn this over to the U.S. attorney. That was not the intent. Honestly, in terms of who would be turned over to in my view, when I was director, the agency would only turn over information to the U.S. attorney, the Department of Justice, or the agency in situations where the company basically lied. So they said, yes, we have AAPs in place, all of these establishments, and they didn't. It was just a lie. Well, that would be a false statement to the government. That would be extremely problematic. And I assume that no one on this call would do. So now let me go to questions. I'm gonna end my screen sharing. Good to see you all again. Let me go to the questions. Do you have any thoughts on whether the Section 503 and VEVRA APs should be combined due to their mirroring or separated out for a total of 3 APs per establishment or function? I've always supported, and the advice that I give is to have 3 separate documents. One reason why that's important is that you don't make the mistake of not including one by accident. 2, it gives each of them equal dignity. So you're treating the protected classes in the EO similarly to Section 503 and VEVRA. And it allows you, this is one thing I recommend, is in your narratives for each one that you include information about your DEIA initiatives, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility initiatives. It's also just easier then to confirm that you have one in place. You don't have to actually look through the combined 503 and VEVRA document because you have 3 in place, so you can easily know that you have 3 files in place. You can verify. What if, this is a very good question. What if you're, by the way, the last one was too, because that's a frequent issue that comes up. This one is also a good question, and I'm not sure if I'm gonna have a satisfactory answer to it. What if your EO1 identifiers don't align with your functional areas per your FAP agreement, your FAAP, Functional Affirmative Action Program agreement with OFCCP? Well, you know, they're likely not to, which is the whole idea of a functional affirmative action program. The agency has not fully advised yet what they're going to do if you have a FAP. Now, the agency doesn't have a lot of FAPs. I mean, just as a rough number, what I recall was it was less than 100. I strongly encouraged FAPs while I was there. I think companies should consider them. But typically it was really large federal contractors with tens of thousands of employees in actual lines of business where you could have, and it's not like 5 people, it's 500, where you would have a functional affirmative action program for that line of business across the country. Some FAP groups would have thousands of people in them, just so you know. So it's probably, the agency will probably be working with their, you know, a defined subset of companies who have FAPs, and presumably they will provide an interface that will allow those companies to certify per each business unit. Now, if they don't, what I would suspect the agency may do is say, look, as long as you have a functional affirmative action program in place for every line of business, you can go ahead and verify for every establishment. Because it says, if applicable. It also mentions the FAP requirements in the language, the certification language. Now, you may ask me why I haven't gone over the certification language specifically. And this is notable. The agency has not included the certification language on this page, as you can see. So this is something this is not here either. So this is something that the agency, you know, may still be updating that language. The language is in the original administrative guide that was approved by OMB, and there is language also that was approved by OMB, and it's basically what I told you, having an AAP in place for every establishment, if applicable, or line of business, having an AAP program in place, basically, and then it cites to the affirmative action regulations. There's also one that says you don't, and then there's one that says, well, you're developing your affirmative action programs. You know, as we get closer to the actual certification date, where I presume the agency will have that specific data, and we will have a portal, which I can do the same thing, go through the portal with you, step by step, I will do so. Planning to do an affirmative action verification part 4. So stay tuned. I'll be with you step by step through this. We may do a part 5. I want to make sure everyone is able to comply. I think that's extraordinarily important. I'm hoping to see the agency do this as well. I think it's really important because it's fine to listen to me, Greg Lean, former OFCCP director, advisor in this area to federal contractors, and I plan to continue doing that. But it would be also really useful for OFCCP, for its policy division, its outstanding policy division. They do excellent work there. To have them, or perhaps the leadership at OFCCP, I used to do a lot of these myself too, come out and talk about the requirement and take people step by step through it to relieve any anxiety, and also allow for a question and answer, almost like a town hall. I think that would be extraordinarily useful to federal contractors. It's something I would have done if I was director. I have a feeling that that is coming soon, because that is always, in my experience, that is Tina Williams' approach to these things. She likes to get out a lot of information. I think it's useful that we have all of these videos, and I suspect you're going to see a lot more information as we get closer to the first date, February 1st, 2022, when the registration opens. And that's all the questions. And we kept it to 1 hour and 3 minutes. And I started 3 minutes late, so we kept it to 1 hour. So everyone, thank you so much for joining me today. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. My email address is Craig, C-R-A-I-G, period, Lean, L-E-E-N, at klgates.com. One other thing I wanted to share with you. Let me just show you something since I have all of you. Let me share this again. Take a look at this real fast. So if you want to use the K&L Gates resources that we have in this area, you can type my name and K&L Gates to a web browser. You go to me, and that's all my information for you. You can go down here to Thought Leadership Powered by Hub. And you can go here to all of the different webinars I've done in articles, including this article, which I want to make sure everyone knew about, and you should take a look at it, written by me and Aaron Rigney, a colleague of mine in our Chicago office. OFCCP Affirmative Action Verification Interface has arrived, and the time to certify is fast approaching. This goes through in much more detail. Well, actually not much more detail. I did speak for an hour, but in a lot of detail. All of the requirements, what's the announcement of the contractor portal, has footnotes, and a lot of very specific information. So take a look at that. It might be helpful to you as well. And again, this is being recorded, and you will be able to access this recording on Thought Leadership Powered by Hub. And there'll be a link to it under my name. And in fact, there's a lot of different OFCCP resources here, webinars, things like that, that helps companies with compliance, which is what my focus is. So thank you very much, everyone. Hope you have a wonderful day, and stay tuned for Affirmative Action Verification Initiative Part 4